Hi everyone, today I will present the paper, An Investigation of Auditor Decision Processes in the Evaluation of Internal Controls and Audit Scope Decisions. So this paper actually studies auditor judgment. It's an extension of the Mock and Turner study, which had a sample size of 200 auditors. And in that prior study, they identified the lacking consensus in auditor judgment, but they didn't explain why there's a difference in the auditor judgment. So the research suggests there's a lack of consensus, and this can increase audit costs. So the motivation behind the study is to explain why there's a lack of consensus. And they propose verbal protocol analysis, or VPA, to address the research question. And VPA can actually provide detailed evidence of information processing of a person's behavior. So why they use VPA is to determine the difference in internal control evaluation and audit scope decisions. And the study uses 4 experienced auditors, and the subjects are provided an audit case to evaluate, actually 2 types of audit cases, to evaluate internal controls over a company's revenue cycle, and then make 4 sample decisions. In the 2 audit cases, the first one consisted of the strong treatment, which included a significant improvement in the internal control environment, and the second case is the fair treatment, which included a moderate change in the internal control environment. So this experiment was held in a conference room with the researcher present, and the subject was instructed to think out loud while performing the task. And for the data analysis, the researcher performed independent coding of 45,000 words. And they also used the theory of human problem solving to break down the data analysis into 2 levels. At the macro level, the operators were broken down into 4 categories. First one is task structuring, then information acquisition, analytical, and action. And this, the macro level analysis really focuses on the subject's behavior. Now at the macro level, it's a higher overview of the subject's behavior, and they use episode abstracts and flowcharts. What an episode abstract is, it's a summary or a segment of the subject's behavior, and the flowchart is a link connecting those segments. And this is the illustration for the macro level data analysis they performed. So here you can see the different categories of operators, task structuring, information acquisition, analytical, and action. And these are the key operators, and we also have a definition for each operator. Now for the results of the study, the operators, information search and evaluation, which fall under information acquisition and analytical, were predominant. And this makes sense because internal control evaluation and audit scope decisions describe a complex and very high information load task. And there were also 2 different patterns that were observed for decision behavior: the systemic and directed strategy. So for example, subject C uses the systemic strategy, which entails a sequential search for information. And subject C first looks at the general audit binder, then they look at the revenue binder, and then search for information in that manner. Whereas in the directed strategy, subject D starts with the audit procedure, and then he searches for relevant information. So I think they call that a top-down approach. So the directed strategy took less time and made fewer changes to the sample size, and they also attended to less information. They attended to 35% of the available information, whereas the systemic strategy attended to 80% of the information. So there was a lack of consensus in decision for sample size, and this was due for different reasons. The subjects followed different strategies, systemic versus directed. They also had different internal control reliance, if you remember the fair treatment versus the strong treatment. And they also used different heuristics. But what I found really interesting is that the subjects follow a pattern that is observed in medical research. They generated alternatives early in the task, but only after they received supporting information. So what this means is, for example, that the auditor may have a sample size in mind, but they may or may not modify their sample size only after they receive relevant information. And this study sheds light on why auditors lack consensus on a given task. It complements the Mock and Turner study, which identified there's a lack in consensus among auditors, but didn't explain why there's a lack of consensus. And finally, the study highlights how difficult it is to evaluate complex tasks. And I did have some points for discussion. I think one of the strengths of the paper is that it uses VPA, or verbal protocol analysis, because this method can capture the step-by-step information about how a person, in this case an auditor, makes a decision. And the second strength, the experiment took place in a real-life setting. They used 4 auditors, and the auditors were given the task to evaluate internal control and also the audit scope or sample size decision. Now, some of the weaknesses of the study, they used 4 experienced auditors, which is a small sample size. And as Professor Helen said, that's usually an issue in experimental studies. And prior belief may lead to low quality judgment. So this is related to the belief bias paradigm, where, for example, the auditor may be recurring on the engagement, and he or she may inherently believe the client is good or the client is honest, and for those reasons may not modify the sample size or may lower the sample size, which is probably not the right thing to do. And pressure. So because the researcher was present, there could be a possibility that the subject was pressured into saying things he thought the researcher may want to hear. And the last weakness is an ability to recall information that is performed automatically. And I did have a question. I don't think there's a right answer to this, but I just wanted to see different points of view. When do you guys think it would be beneficial to follow a systemic or directed strategy?
That's a good question.
I don't think there's a right answer for it. It just probably depends on the task.
Right.
That's all I have.
So let's talk about. So verbal protocols are interesting, and so a small sample size is usually acceptable because it's a very invasive type of approach to auditor judgment or judgment and decision making in general, and so And there's a whole literature on VPAs, and there are a number of studies that have used VPAs. Because of the small sample size, especially in today's environment, it is difficult to publish in certain journals verbal protocol analysis. Not impossible, just difficult, because people are like, oh well, there's only a small sample size. But what you're not in this case, they presented 2 scenarios, right? And they presented the strong controls and fair controls, and really driven by trying to understand when auditors would use those strategies, whether or not in a strong, if I haven't read the paper in a while, but whether or not in a strong environment they would use one versus the other, would there be some differences? And so what verbal protocol analysis will lead is for researchers to think differently about things that they manipulate or priors that they might have on how auditors make decisions in these environments. So verbal protocol analysis should always, and probably always leads to more research, right? Because it just provides a window into how auditors are making decisions, how they're processing information. And so, Andrea, would you mind putting your slide back up that breaks it down into the various tasks, right? So that's drawn from, obviously, research on human information processing. So it's starting from that standpoint. There's no reason for us to believe that auditors don't process information as most humans do. And so we're starting with that point of, well, and so you can now evaluate at what point auditors might be deviating from what might be considered an optimal strategy. So you can look at any of these different operators and perform, maybe suggest that there should be more research, on the analytical phase of information, judgment and decision making, or information acquisition, how auditors are searching for information. So what a verbal protocol does is allows you kind of to get in the black box of how auditors are making decisions. And it is difficult. So I think I presented this. I did present this at one of the car lab meetings. So some of you might have been there, but we're actually working on a verbal protocol analysis with one of the firms that we're working with. And so Mikolos, myself, and Ted Mock, and a few of the PhD students, including Andrea, helped us with the coding of it. It is one of the most difficult projects that I've ever worked on in terms of labor intensive. It's a very labor intensive research approach because you have to code. There's nothing, like we tried having there's nothing, you as the researcher have to code what they're saying, break it down into these various operators such as task structuring, information acquisition. And so you have two people coding, and you try to reconcile. And Ted and I literally spent what I felt like was the entire last half of my sabbatical on coding this project. And then Andrea Godson came in and helped us try to organize what we did code. And so it's which is why you don't see researchers doing a lot of this, is because it is very labor intensive, but I think it's also very informative. And so what we were looking at was the risk assessment process, because that is the audit risk assessment process is the framework from which the audit is developed, right? So based on the auditor's assessment of risk is going to impact the nature, the timing, and the extent of the audit procedures they perform. So we wanted to understand, well, how are they making this? Like, what are the factors? How are they structuring this risk assessment process? So we actually had access to partners and managers, and I think we did 4 teams. But we have 5 verbal protocols in total, because we have one person who just did it off the top of his head, which is what we call a retrospective. So he was thinking back. And the difference between, in this case, what Biggs and Mock did was they actually gave them a case. So it wasn't freewheeling, right? It was a case. And so they could really focus on what information they were capturing in that case. They could actually look at the outcome because they gave them a case within But in our situation, we couldn't do that because it was freewheeling. It was a different clients, different partners, and we just listened to them go through the planning process and what information they were trying to capture.
Do you think there's a better way to do it? Is a case study better or freewheeling, as you call it?
Well, I think it depends on what you're trying. In this case, because they were looking at internal controls, right? The case was probably fine because you get them focused on a particular set of facts, right? For what we were trying to do, we were more. It was ambitious, but we were trying to capture it across different industries, and we were trying to capture the if it's a new client versus a recurring client. And what we had was the manager on the engagement was always new, so we were really wanting to take it back to try to take out the artificiality of the process. We wanted it to be as natural as possible, and so leaving it open where we just had them recall their own case, right? So we didn't seed anything in the cases, right? We didn't have a case, so we didn't seed anything. So it was open season. Whatever is considered, right? So if we had a case, then we're constraining it. So a case constrains it to a narrow set of possibilities, whereas so it's yet to be seen. We're still coding. Coding was a nightmare. The other part of the way that what's good with a case is that the set of facts are the same, right? So it makes coding somewhat easier, and analysis. Really, what it does is it makes analysis a little bit more less ambiguous. That's the challenge we're having, is the analysis with what we did. Is how do we capture this? What's the story we're going to tell with this? I also used verbal protocol analysis, and actually we're trying to back up a little bit for the risk assessment, planning risk assessment. We're actually trying to get more data. Like, we want to go back to the people that participated to find out, well, what actually was your risk assessment, because we only know the process leading up to it. We don't know how they actually assess the risk. And then also not only what your planning risk assessment was, but then in hindsight, after the audit was completed, how did that risk assessment really map? So we want to find that out. But then I also do this with, so we're going to try to get more for this particular risk assessment project. We're going to try to get more access to more partners and managers because our sample size right now for at least the concurrent protocols are 4. And what we found was the way that we set it up was that the manager was rolling on to the client. So it was we didn't set it up the way, that's just how it ended up. But the manager was rolling on to the client. So, and the partner it was a continuing engagement for the partner. And the partner, so it in a lot of instances, it had the effect of having there probably being a lot more discussion around risk assessment because there were no priors for the manager. So the manager probably asked questions that if he or she had been a recurring manager might not have asked, right? Because they already have priors about the client. So, we think that in that format, we probably got a lot richer data set because of that. But we'd like to get access to more partners and managers so we can increase the sample size somewhat. I also used verbal protocol when I did my dissertation, and I had, because as I told you before, I had them interact with a simulated client electronically, and and I kind of sat there in a corner while they talked, and so what was hard for them that was different from the risk assessment was they had to talk to the computer, and that was hard, right? Because they would put in something and the simulated client would respond, and then they would have to respond, right? So I had to get them to, I had to keep saying, could you speak up, things like that. So that was a little trick, but in this environment, I didn't have to do that. We didn't have, because they were having a natural discussion about risk. So so I think we moved away a little bit from you know, people feeling pressure to talk, or like, is this what the researcher wants to hear? And because we weren't using a case, there were no preconceived, okay, is there a right or wrong answer in this case? Am I getting to the right answer? So that's where I think we have an advantage in this freewheeling, because there is no right or wrong answer. It's your client, and we're just trying to understand how you approach risk assessment. So I think verbal protocols are really, really interesting. There's some drawbacks to it, and you pointed out some where people are not you don't naturally sit at your computer and start talking to it. And that's some of the things that, like, I got much more information in the risk assessment than I did for my when I did my dissertation, and they were basically talking to the computer. I don't feel that they probably was as talkative had they been sitting across from someone. So that's some of the drawbacks. But this is an early example, or a different example of experimental research where you're trying to gather information about the auditor's decision process.
I have a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the different strategies to make it more realistic and not staged, to see how the auditors are thinking. I guess I like the experiment you described where it was the two managers talking to each other about a new engagement.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a very natural setting. But I feel like all the other settings, making somebody talk out loud, especially if it's an individual task that they would probably do and prepare and then present it to, say, the manager with their final results. I was just wondering, are there any studies that look at, like, instead of the verbal, have the subjects just sit on a computer and brainstorm and write what they're thinking? I know that's probably hard to control, but I feel like for someone like me, I know if someone asked me to say what I'm thinking out loud, I could do it, but my thought process is completely different than how I actually would do it and brainstorm silently by just writing.
Yeah,
so I
and I believe there is. I can't think of it. I know, for example, this wasn't a verbal protocol, but with negotiations, there's been research with people. You're negotiating with a counterpart over, like, you're emailing back and forth. You're negotiating. You're getting a response timely. So it's not, the objective isn't the same, because again, it was a case and they manipulated, different aspects of the case. But, and actually it was interesting because Elizabeth Scher, who is visiting, we were talking about an eye tracking study, right? Which is not invasive in a way, because you're at the computer, you're doing something, you're doing whatever, and it's tracking your movements. Because there's a whole literature on eye tracking, and what that tells you about the decision, or where people focus on information and stuff like that. So that's a little less intrusive, and it would be, we don't know what we would do, but it was like, is there it has all kinds of logistical kinds of problems, right? Because you have to set up eye tracking, and so it would be difficult to do that logistically with auditors unless we can get a firm who is interested in doing something like that. But again, it's another way to maybe think about capturing information without being intrusive, right? So I think technology will, it's just how creative you can be with it. Will probably provides, as you pointed out, different avenues to maybe get at the same thing without this idea, because most people do find it difficult to just talk out loud. I found that though, once they got into it, like after a while, I wasn't there anymore, and so they just engaged. They started talking. It became natural for them. At first, it was awkward, and then they just started to, from my dissertation, once they got into the heat of the negotiation, and this was, in my example, this is someone who went the full number of rounds. The partners, he's, going back at the computer, he's like, okay, is that your response? Well, now what that leads me to believe is that you have something to hide. I mean, these are the kinds of, so I'm going to be, so after a while he got into it without me having to continue. But at first it is very, and I also think it's the person too.
Yeah.
Right? Some people are just not comfortable, you know. They're so intuitive, like they're just in their head all the time.
Yeah, because I know, like you were saying, like just like getting comfortable speaking. There's still, I think, certain people, personality types. Like I know me.
Mm-hmm.
Even if I'm comfortable speaking, what I say is very well thought out. So
Right.
I usually answer questions very slowly because I've thought of maybe 5 other things that no
Mhm.
one ever
Right.
hears me verbalize. So
Right.
I'm wondering if that might change. I mean, I guess it's hard because every individual is different. So I don't know.
Right, and the other thing is too, that's the importance of having something that where there is no right or wrong answer, because then you're just trying to capture their approach. So if you look at the operators, it's just how they are structuring the task, like what, you know,
That's
the things
true.
that they are saying. Do they spend a lot of time structuring the task, setting a goal? How much of their analytics is focused on assumptions versus comparison versus so it's really just trying to break down the process into how humans process information, as opposed to this is the right answer.
Yeah. Well, I guess you're right too, because
Mhm.
even though it might not be the first thought, you can still kind of follow
Mm-hmm.
from whatever is spoken. Like you said, you can
Right.
categorize and you can still see their train of thought. So
Right.
I guess that doesn't really matter as much.
Right, and it's
They're-
not in setting up the test. You're not trying. You don't
Yeah.
even. They're blind to the experimental condition, right? So they don't know if you are trying to determine a directed approach or a systemic approach. They're blind, and that's the key thing in all experiments. The participants are blind to the condition that they're in.
Mhm.
Right? They don't know that there are 2, 3, 4, 5 conditions. They're just responding to the case, and that's what's so important, is in making sure that they're randomly assigned. So which is easy enough to do. Yeah.
Back to the paper, it's a case research, and the sample is not random. It's 4 samples, but maybe the researchers choose these 4 samples. What kind of consideration for VPA research to select the sample for the research?
Well, usually you're not choosing, right? You, in this case, and in most cases, right? You make a request to the firm, because you don't know how people are going to make decisions, right? You have no idea. You don't. So you just request that I'm sure they probably wanted more. Like they probably requested more people, but they got 4 at a minimum, and that was for this type of research. 4 was an acceptable sample. Like when I go, the only thing that I will request is a certain experience level, because for certain like as I said, doing auditor client negotiations, I need partners and managers. So I will request partners and managers, right? So that's the only thing that I request. I have no control over who I get, and then I have in checks to determine if they're, firms will comply. I mean, most times I've requested a certain level, I've gotten it, maybe they've thrown in a couple of people who didn't meet the criteria, but you could just exclude those people from your sample. So it's not like they go and cherry pick and say, okay, well I had 20 and I'm going to pick these 4. No, that's not how it happens.
Another question is for VPA, different coder, different researcher could have different result from the same document.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we deal with that?
So you're supposed to go through reconcile. So for
Yeah.
example, so we all agree. So like for instance, when Ted and I worked on this VPA project with risk assessment, Ted is, this is his wheelhouse, right? He's done, this is where he's an expert in verbal protocol analysis. He's done tons of research in this area. So I basically followed his lead. But we agreed on these operators, and we use the same operators. They're pretty standard, and it was reasonable based on human information processing, right? So we agreed on the structuring. So we coded independently, and the only thing we were doing was taking the data, what they said, and putting it in based on my perception. If I considered something that the person did, I considered that, say, as task structuring, then I coded it as such. And so we coded separately. And we didn't have any conditions, right? So, one of the things that you want to do is make sure when you're coding that you're blind to the condition, right? As a coder, even though I could be the researcher, when I get it, I shouldn't know that that person is in a particular condition, right? So as long as but in our case, we didn't have conditions. We were just collecting, data about the risk assessment process. And so I coded independently of Ted, then he coded, and then we both looked at how we coded, right? And so we identified where there were similarities and identified where there were differences. And so, in most cases, we were probably over 80% consistent. And so for those items that we coded differently, we discussed. And we had to come up with, and most of them we were able to agree. He saw my point. In some cases, like, okay, if you say it that way, I agree. And same thing, he would say, okay, Helen, that makes sense. And then what we would see, because your coding is based on how you're interpreting that information, that a lot of them we could then just clear up, because once you turn the dial and say, okay, I see why that would be interpreted. So we had a discussion about it and reached an agreement. And in cases where, and then I've had other things that I've coded, not for verbal protocol, but because in some of my experiments I asked for free thought, like we'll code, and then we'll have a third person code and reconcile the differences. So there are ways, you try to reconcile the differences.
Thanks.